Okay.
You guys ready?
Yep. We are ready. Just let me know when we're recording and when I should start. Hi everyone, my name is Chris Gampat and welcome to Inside the Photographer's Mind. For those of you who don't know who I am the editor-in-chief of the Phoblographer. We are a blog that's been around for 8 years. Yeah, this month 8 years now, and we do reviews, tutorials, news, features, and interviews on our website. And this show is sort of an evolution of the interviews that we've been doing. So for our first episode, we are featuring photographer Viviane Goussois. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes.
Yes.
You got
Viviane is a Sony artisan, New York native, and has been a photographer for quite a while, I understand, correct?
It's been 7 or 8 years. I feel like the longer that it goes on, the more hazy I am with how long it's been exactly, but yeah, it's in the 7 or 8 year range.
Okay. And what do you really describe yourself as? Because you're well known for work that you've done in the Arctic, and obviously some of the work that people are seeing right now in the feed. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of snowy kind of landscapes and cityscapes in New York. But what do you kind of see yourself as?
I think that I started out as a street photographer, like that would have been an easy way to classify what it is that I was doing in New York. And then I kind of morphed more into the realm of conceptual photography. So I would say that I am a conceptual photographer who veers into travel photography every once in a while.
All right.
Yeah.
And you said that you started out in street photography. Talk to us about how you got into photography.
Yeah. So some context. I'll try to make it really as brief as I can. So I grew up here in New York in Flushing, Queens. And I didn't grow up with a lot in Queens. Definitely grew up on kind of the edges of poverty, and had kind of challenging circumstances as a kid, and I ended up moving out on my own when I was 17 due to religious differences with my parents, and I got disowned. And so that kind of prompted me to have to figure things out really quickly in terms of life and in terms of survival. So I spent pretty much the next 13 years of my life, from like 17 to 30, basically working every single job that I could, pretty much everything that exists in New York: waitress, bartender, retail, every single administrative job that exists in offices probably. And I was working about 7 days a week for 12 years straight. And I came to a breaking point where I realized that I really physically and mentally couldn't keep living that kind of life. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. And so I decided, okay, maybe I can go back to school. I'll go to school for pre-med, because if I'm going to go back to school, I'm going to go back to school for something that is going to give a big payoff for me in terms of being a challenge, and in terms of being, I really love science in general growing up. So in terms of something that I would love, and also in terms of financial stability. So I took out loans, because America, and that was really stressful, because it was the first time in my life that basically I wasn't working and that I had these loans looming over my head. The course load was pretty challenging, and so I would basically just walk around as my method of de-stressing from everything that I was going through. And I would come back from my walks, and I've always been a writer. Like, writing was sort of my way to escape my childhood circumstances. And so I would come back and I would tell my roommates about everything that I saw on my walks. And I think after a while of doing that, they were kind of sick of hearing me wax poetic about, sidewalks and light and streets and, oh my goodness, this amazing piece of brick, it reminded me of this movie and all of this stuff. And one of them really flippantly told me, why don't you just take a picture? Like, basically, enough,
Versus
take a
like
picture.
trying to describe a New York bodega or something like that.
Right. And I was still really broke. I was literally living off of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at that point. as my main sustenance for every meal. And I was like, you know what? That's an excellent idea. Let me look and see if I can find something that I can afford. Like, it has to be under $100. Surely there's something out there. So I went on Amazon at the time, and I found a point-and-shoot camera that was $79, and it was like super thrilling because it wasn't $100, and I was really excited. And it arrived broken, as things happen in life. And the way that it was broken was that the white balance was stuck to the shade setting, but it wasn't like a really nice shade setting. Like, it wasn't a beautiful golden shade. It was this horrible muddy brown shade. So everything just looked like this overwrought sepia image, everything that I took. But I loved, you know, the process of taking the photos. So I ended up going back online and figuring out if there was free software that I could use, and I stumbled upon GIMP, which was free. Well, it still exists. It's free open source software, which I don't know if anybody out there has ever used GIMP, either here or in the live stream universe, but GIMP at the time was basically like, if you think about Photoshop or Lightroom, it was like this super archaic, primitive version of everything that you could do in those, but just extremely complex and difficult to figure out, like not intuitive at all. But I taught myself how to edit the problem of the shade settings so I could actually see my photos for what they were. But in the process, I really fell in love with editing because I realized that what I was seeing in the story that was in my head about all of the images that I was seeing kind of wasn't the exact reality that I was taking a photo of. And editing let me sort of imbue everything that I wanted to imbue into the photos.
So do you feel that, you said that you used to take these walks to kind of de-stress, and you just described your editing process. Do you feel that that stress may have influenced your creative vision in some way, and you were trying to kind of relay that through your images?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that when I first started, I was definitely taking photos as a form of escapism, which is kind of how I had been as a writer and also as a pianist growing up. Like, I played piano. Everything that I did artistically was always to kind of escape the stress I was dealing with my whole life. So I think in a way it was sort of the result of that stress, but it was also a way to sort of figure out how to create another world through my images that was sort of the world that I would revert back to, that made me happy, going through all the stressful time periods.
Well, you're not going through those stressful time periods right now, right?
I mean...
It's nothing like what you were going through.
No, not at all. I would say that I think everybody consistently goes through some sorts of, you know, existential stress as they go through life, and I don't think that I'm exempt from that at all. I would say that my stress currently has more to do with sort of figuring out things with my career and stuff like that versus when I started, which was how do I survive, how do I eat today, how do I get through organic chemistry and not fail,
right.
How do I pay rent, basically. So I think, you know, the stressors have changed, but to a large extent, everything that I still create now, if it's my own personal work, is sort of a way to figure out how to create different worlds and still go on those same sorts of, I don't know, segments of escapism.
Right. Are there any other places where you kind of pull kind of inspiration from? I mean, some people pull inspiration from like Disney movies or something like that. Actually, a lot of photographers love to pull inspiration from the movies, like Blade Runner and all that stuff. I mean, what's sort of your influences? I mean, we see a lot of the images right here in the feed, you know, like there's a lot of isolation. Mm-hmm. But then, as we'll show later on for your work in the Arctic, there is still that sense of isolation. I mean, I'll let you talk.
Well, Blade Runner is my favorite movie of all time, the first one, not the second, which I have a lot of words that I could say about it, but I won't do here. So I grew up definitely escaping into cinema and music. Like, cinema and music are still my biggest sources of inspiration for photography and art in general. And so I think for me, what was powerful growing up, and something I started to think about a lot when I started photographing New York, was that a lot of the people whose films that I grew up watching that had to do with New York, some of whom are very problematic people now, like Woody Allen. When you think about Woody Allen's New York, or when you think of Scorsese's New York, for me, I think what was so interesting when I thought about it was that their New York had nothing at all to do with what New York actually is in reality. That was definitely the New York in their minds. It's a New York that they definitely created. And I would say that that concept of creating your own version of a place that you already live in and experience based on maybe your own experiences or your own influences is definitely something that I've ran with for most of my career.
So that's from the beginning, going through the entire evolution of who you feel you are now as a photographer.
Yeah.
And you've been a photographer that you've worked a lot, you've done a lot of travel work, you've photographed New York a lot, and then you took a trip to the Arctic that you feel has changed you. And I remember specifically seeing you on Instagram saying that, you know, there was you that was pre-Arctic and there was you that was post-Arctic. And you feel like the Arctic really changed you, one, as a person, but how do you feel it changed you as a creative?
Oh, that's a really heavy, interesting question. It changed everything about how I approached my career, how I approached art, how I approached myself, and how I approached the world and Earth, which is a lot, which is to say everything, every aspect. It was such an unbelievable set of circumstances that I was in when I was there. It was a trip that was put on by an astronaut, a Canadian astronaut named Commander Hatfield, who's an incredible person, has a phenomenal life story of his own, as you could imagine. And he basically chose 10 people to go with him to the Arctic on an icebreaker and go into the Canadian high Arctic specifically. So we started off in Greenland and then went all the way up through the Canadian high Arctic, kind of semi-close to the North Pole. And I think for me, prior to the trip, I was doing a lot of travel photography, but a lot of the travel photography that I was doing was a result of my audience. So a lot of it was, you know, destinations would kind of come to me based on my audience numbers, and then I would travel to these various places. And a lot of it was starting to feel devoid of purpose for me. Like, it was a lot of very interesting travel. I had a lot of really profound experiences while traveling, but I was getting a little bit disenchanted with the experience overall in terms of having it as a function of me being a photographer. And so when I went to the Arctic, it kind of like completely changed every aspect of how I felt about that world. And I think it had to do with everything that we were seeing. I mean, the amounts of ice and ice melt that we saw, we were with glaciologists, to like just kind of a lot of the profound concepts that I started thinking about while I was there. And I think once I came back, it was such a heavy experience that I realized that I was so fundamentally changed, and I kind of had to figure out what I was going to do next after that. So that was at the end of 2016. And so I've kind of spent this whole year figuring that out in terms of where I'm at with photography and what I want to do financially with photography, and you know, do I still want to travel? Do I still want to do the same work that I was doing before? Or do I not want to do that? Do I want to move in a completely different direction with my career? does New York define me as a person? Does the Arctic now define me? I mean, I think it like just brought up so many very deep questions for me. So it was a profound experience in that way.
So there was you that was shooting pre-Arctic, and then you kind of evolved, and then the Arctic happened, and you've more or less taken like a creative break, more or less, this year. How do you feel that that has affected what you do and how you judge whether or not you should actually click the shutter? Like, for example, the moments of, a lot of photographers describe looking at a moment and saying, oh, you know, that's something I really want to shoot right now. So they go ahead and they do it. But that differs based on so many different photographers. What one person sees in one landscape, another person might not see. So how do you feel that that has changed ever since you went to the Arctic?
I'm not sure that the core has changed for me in terms of like how I would make a decision to take a photo or not. Like that hasn't changed. Like for example, I can get into the body of work that went into my book, New York in the Snow. It's interesting to me to look back on it, on how little footage I actually shot when I was out in each snowstorm. So I think when I first started, obviously I started right at the beginning of my career, and I knew less about why I was shooting. And I think it took me about 2 years of shooting in snowstorms to figure out, wait a minute, like there are motifs that I keep shooting over and over again. There's themes that I keep shooting and obviously going back to over and over again. This is actually something bigger than I thought that it was at the beginning. And once I started pursuing that, I started taking less and less photos because I kind of had a better idea of why I was going out in the first place and walking like 7 miles and shooting in the snow. So I think that more than the Arctic had refined sort of like what makes me actually take a photo on a personal level. Well, I did definitely take a creative break this year. I've still been shooting professionally for like commissioned work and licensed work, which I think is like a totally different area of my photography career. And that of course is kind of like, that's governed by, you know, a lot of client things and a lot of all of that sort of thing that goes into commissioned work for me. But when it comes to personal work, I would say that the snow, if anything, definitely kind of made me a lot more choosy and picky, which is interesting because like I've never shot film, but I kind of look at it as when I am out shooting in the snow for the book, when I was, it definitely felt more like maybe I was shooting more as a film photographer versus digital, because I definitely limited myself to what I would take in terms of content and what I wanted to get out of it. And I treated like every single time that I tapped the shutter as like this super precious moment. I think the way that maybe somebody who shoots film would do. You could probably tell me because you shoot film.
I
don't shoot film. But yeah, so I don't know if that answered the question. But
that does answer the question, but then my bigger question then is, where do you see yourself going as a photographer, if you don't mind telling the audience, unless you think that's something that, you know, you want to say at a later point or something like that?
No.
Sweet.
So this is interesting because I've actually alluded to it a little bit, but I haven't like formally talked about it yet. So I guess now I'm doing that. So yeah, I definitely took this year to think a lot about what it is that I want to do next. And I think that became a sort of breakup and grieving process for me, because for so many years, my whole world and my career was defined by New York City photography. And that's been amazing on so many different levels, but it also kind of made me feel like, wait, is this what I'm meant to do forever? Does this mean I can never shoot anything else? Am I just the New York City photographer, as everybody always introduces me? And I think that hit me really hard this year, because when I started thinking a lot about what I want to do for the next phase, I had to sort of like go through a grieving process for what I call the first part of my career, which was the first 2 books that I put out and that first body of work, in order to like kind of get past it and get excited again about what it is that I want to do. So I feel like it became this weird convoluted grieving process. But basically, to actually answer your question, since I see your face right now. So basically, when I was in the Arctic, I started thinking a lot about, and I really hope this doesn't come off as super pretentious, what I'm about to say. I started to think quite a lot about time as a concept. I think this happened for a variety of reasons. One, I'm getting a lot older than I was. You know, my 20s are really far away now, and my 30s are almost far away now. And time for me was already something that was super on my mind. But when we were on the icebreaker, we had one day at sea, at ice, if you want to say. And there was a documentary that the ship played that day, because you know, you had to kind of like fill the time because we weren't actually leaving the icebreaker. And the documentary was about the people of Greenland who we were about to sort of see and meet and come in contact with, and the way that they conceptualize time and the way that they view their seasons. And I was so struck by it because...
Give us like an example.
Sure. Like, so for people in Greenland, obviously like time as a construct is sort of, it's the result of the environment around us, it's a result of culture, and it's a result of religion to some extent, and all these other forces that make us view it a certain way. So for Greenland, because they go through such extreme periods of light and darkness, because of the sun and their position on the earth, all of their seasons have to do with light and darkness. And for me, I started thinking about that a lot because, I mean, I kind of had always realized, okay, you know, other people's concept of time is different than mine. But when you really start thinking about it a lot, like for example, our concept of time here in New York City is very different from somebody on the West Coast. You know, our concept of time is sort of like governed by seasons. So when we kind of poetically talk about things, or when we create music, or we talk about the life cycle, you know, everything's like, oh, birth is in the spring, and then it's the summer of our lives, and then it's the fall, and then in the winter it's barren, and that is when we die. And you know, when you really think about it in that way, that's very different from how somebody who doesn't live with 4 distinct seasons would really think about their concept of time, and very different from people in another hemisphere who aren't even experiencing winter right now, they're experiencing summer. So I started thinking a lot about that, and it was really interesting to me to think about that for a long time and kind of think about my own internal issues with time and philosophical
So you want to find a way to conceptualize these into photos?
I mean, I don't want to give it all away here.
Why not?
But I'm also very much interested in mixed reality, so I'm very interested in virtual reality, AR, the mixture of the two. And I'm also interested in, I've always been interested in mixing photography with writing. So I think for me, what I've been thinking a lot about for the last couple of months is how to sort of, there's all various different levels to what I want to do, but I guess on a grand concept, it's though the exploration of time from an internal and an external level, and that's all I can say.
Okay, that's totally fine. We're going to take a quick break and a deviation to do something that I feel is going to be a little fun. Vivienne didn't know about this. So we're going to do a couple of photography history questions that I feel a lot of people out there will love, and also it'd be interesting to see if you know these. So the first question is, what does TLR stand for?
I think this is twin lens reflex.
That is correct. That is absolutely correct.
What do I get?
You'll have to talk to Adorama about that.
Okay.
Maybe later on. Exactly. Yeah. What famous YouTube photographer says the quote, "I shoot raw"? Is it Tony Northrup, Gordon Lang, or Jared Polin?
Oh, Jared.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Chronos photos.
Yes.
Yes.
Here's one for you because you said you started out in street photography. What method do street photographers use to get their subjects in focus most of the time?
Okay, you're talking about most street photographers.
Yeah, I'm talking
not
about.
specifically.
I'm
me,
not talking
but
about. Yeah.
Like back button focus, or is that where you're going with this, or I don't know.
I don't know. How did you do it?
I didn't do anything fancy. I did what anybody else would do, which was just try to focus manually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what is that term that is very popularly used amongst a number of street photographers?
I have no idea.
Okay. It's zone focusing, otherwise known as hyperfocal length shooting. And that's usually when you focus out to maybe 6 feet away and you stop down to somewhere like f5.6, and you know that maybe this much is in focus, and you just have to wait for someone to kind of move into that field, which I'm sure is what you did in some ways.
I can honestly say I've never gotten that complex, even with the snow photography.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I will say that with the snow photography, that is an interesting thing to think of. Somebody here in the live audience asked me if I ever used a tripod, and also sort of like how I shot, and that's interesting because like I do everything's on manual all the time for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much a control freak in that way. But that's interesting to consider because every single block I would initially have to like change everything up because every single block at night in the snow, everything changes in terms of lighting and environment and everything. So if I wanted to like wait for somebody to be in focus, it would be like a totally different set of circumstances all the time. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Interesting.
Speaking about you shooting in the snow, you have this book called New York in the Snow. Mm-hmm. And it is your second book, correct? Now, your first book was mostly photos of New York. Mm-hmm. And then the story behind this one is that a lot of people who saw your images, they were really in love with your snowy photos the most. And your affinity for the snow, where did that kind of come from? Because I'm a winter person as well, but like I have friends that are like, Chris, you're crazy. Like, you shouldn't go for runs in the winter. It's bad for your health. You should do it during the summer. No, I'm all about doing that.
Yeah.
I hate the summer. But, like, what made you really love the winter?
Huh. That's a deep question. I hate when people say that, by the way. That's a deep question. As if I'm inferring everything else is not.
Right.
That's not true.
Yeah.
I think that it all really comes down to there's one memory that I kept going back to when I was going through really rough times in my 20s and really struggling. And that memory was when I was little. So my father was a union pressman for the Daily News. And what that means is like he was one of the guys who basically like rolled the huge rolls of paper around and loaded the printing presses. And it was a really tough job actually, physically, mentally, and he was always away because he worked nights. But there was a blizzard and he was home, and it was like super rare for him to be home. And he was a very unhappy person in general. But because there was a blizzard and he was home, my neighbors had actually offered like the usage of their sleds. Like they happened to have 2 sleds. And my parents were like, yeah, which was so like out of character for them in general as well. And it was really interesting to see this guy who was just this very unhappy person kind of transform into this child as soon as he stepped outside, you know, and he had the sleds and he was super happy, totally forgot his life and everything that was happening. And it was just this really interesting and magical experience for me as a kid as well, because as we were kind of going through the streets of Flushing, I just remember looking up at the lights and kind of seeing the snow falling around the lights and thinking to myself, like, you know, it doesn't matter that my family doesn't have anything compared to anybody else who's out here in the streets with us, right? We're all looking up at the same light, and we're all experiencing this same kind of moment of joy. And so I kept going back to that in my 20s because literally, like, the only thing I would look forward to for years was going to sleep, because right before I would go to sleep, I would go back to either a memory that I really liked and replay it and kind of relive it and explore that memory in depth, or I would, you know, imagine other things. But that was the one memory that I kept going back to over and over, because it made me happy. It was really pretty. It was awesome to kind of like have that to look forward to every single night when I had like nothing else in my life to look forward to. And then when I started photography, it was really interesting. It was the winter of 2009, 2010, and New York had an incredibly large blizzard. And I had that broken point and shoot. And, you know, I didn't have proper winter clothing. Like, I was wearing jeans. I had like these tattered gloves that had no kind of resistance to anything. And I remember being like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if I went to Central Park with the camera and tried to take photos and tried to, like, I don't know, capture maybe some of the magic of what snow meant to me for all of these years. Like, I didn't actually think that I could do it, but it was just kind of this fun thing to do, and I almost got frostbite. It was like not...
Wearing all that bohemian clothing?
It was not pleasurable, no. But I think it was that moment that I really fell in love, though, with shooting in the snow, because, like, I was really taken in by the fact that I could actually capture that and then maybe share it with other people and share a little bit of that magic with other people.
And obviously, that has grown very popular for you, and you created a whole book about it. But in addition to that, this book also kind of goes into your mind as you created these images, talking about memories and like talking about what you did. But obviously this is more than a coffee table book. It's also something that's kind of like a leaflet from your brain, I guess you could say. What made you choose these specific photos versus like everything else that you may have thrown out?
Well, as I said before, I was very selective. I would say from like 2012, 2013, I got super selective with what I actually shot in the snow. So for every single snowstorm that went on, I would go out. I would walk at a minimum 7 miles, and I wouldn't duck in anywhere because on a practical level, I didn't want to deal with condensation, like, at all. So just on a practical level, I wouldn't duck in. So I knew that I would be out for a while. And because I knew that I would be out for a while, I didn't want to come back home with like 3,000 photos, like when I first started. And I'm sure anybody who does photography has the same story of like, when I started shooting, I shot thousands of photos at a time. Yeah, I didn't want to come home and actually do that, because every time I would get home, I would actually pick out the 10 shots that I liked the most out of that limited set that I shot. I would shoot about like 100 photos, I would say, from each storm. I would pick 10 and I would put them up immediately online. And the reason that I did that kind of went back to my early days in photography, where I was trying to get noticed online, and it was kind of like, I was trying to get people to sort of meet me through my snow photography. So I knew that if I put the images up right away on Reddit or any of the other places that I posted, that...
You were a Reddit spammer?
I wasn't a Reddit spammer, I am a Redditor.
Okay, all right.
I have me some good karma there.
Okay, let's hope so.
But yeah, like I always had that in the back of my mind too, like, oh my God, like even though this is physically like, it was physically demanding to do that. I mean, it was painful. But like I knew, like, okay, I need to get home and have 10 shots. So I definitely thought a lot about that when I was out. Like, I would be like, okay, I know roughly the area that I want to shoot. I kind of know the feeling that I'm going for. Like once I started understanding the themes that I was going for as well, which were isolation and kind of feelings of loneliness in the city and nostalgia as well, I kind of had a better idea of what exactly I wanted to do. So I shot a very limited amount, and then I also shot with knowing that like I was going to have to pick 10 out of that limited amount as like the hero images of the night to initially put up.
Intense, shooting with intent.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you're not shooting with that broken point and shoot anymore that's stuck to shade, right?
No. I think it would be cool if I said yes, though. Whenever people ask me that, I should just be like, yeah. I totally am, and I still use GIMP. And
Perfect. Well, that's an inspiration to a lot of people that want to do this. What are you actually using these days, though? Okay, so like eventually,
my career definitely took a really wild path, I would say. I started posting the images on Tumblr. So one part of the backstory was that once I actually edited the images and learned how to edit them, I asked another of my roommates, I seem to have a history of asking people what to do. I was like, what do I do with these images? And amusingly, they said to me, I don't know, start a blog. And I was like, what is a blog? And I went to Google, and I literally Googled the word blog, because I had no idea what a blog was. And Tumblr came up as one of the top results because it was 2009. And Tumblr was like really at its peak back then. So I was like, oh, Tumblr, this is where people blog. Okay. So I made a Tumblr. I had no idea that it had a social component. But I guess because I was posting original content, which was not amazing in any way, shape, or form, Tumblr started featuring me quite heavily. And I gained this like enormous following in the span of 3 months, which was just completely wild. And I had no idea like how to process that at all. Like I wasn't posting with that intent in any way, shape, or form. But it got me, I really enjoyed kind of the feedback of some of the people who would like respond to me via messages. And I started sharing my work on other social media, and I gained this enormous following over like the span of a year just from doing that. And I ended up getting asked to speak. Actually, it was an Adorama event back in 2012, and it was for women who were photographers but had more to do with like social media and how people with large followings dealt with trolling and other stuff like that. And somebody from Sony was in the audience, and I don't think that they were. So what had happened, I actually skipped a little tiny part. So what had happened is I started, because of Tumblr and all the audience, my images kind of got out there. And I started getting requests for like, oh, you know, can we license this image of yours for a book or for an album cover or for whatever people wanted to license the images for. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm hitting a limitation now. I need to actually upgrade. And I asked another friend of mine, again, who is this like super contrarian programmer guy. I was like, do I get a Canon or a Nikon? I knew nothing about cameras or, you know, photography other than what I had been shooting on. And he was like, why would you get either of those? You should get a Sony. Be different. You know, because he was like this super contrarian guy.
Right.
And I was like, Sony makes cameras? Like DSLRs? Like what? So I went and I looked it up again, and I was like, wow, this is really great. This is totally in my price range. This looks amazing. So I got a Sony A55 as like my first real camera, primarily because I had already gotten like a tiny amount of money from the licensing deals. And I also knew that like I was starting to hit the wall of like quality, you know, shooting on the point and shoot that I was shooting on. So I was shooting with a Sony, and then I did that event at Adorama, and somebody from Sony was there, and I think the person who put on the event had mentioned like, you know, it's so weird, but Vivian actually is a Sony shooter, because back then it was really unusual to shoot Sony. And that person was just elated, and they contacted me, and we started a relationship, and then in 2014 I got officially sponsored by Sony. So I've been shooting Sony since 2012, pretty much.
Using like the A7R?
Yeah, I've used everything pretty much. I mean, I think a lot of the snow photography, so like in the book, it does say under each image like what camera and all the settings and all of that. But But I think for the majority of the book, I shot a lot of it with the A99, which was kind of like, that had come out right before the mirrorless range really came out. And that was like one of my favorite cameras ever to use in the snow. And then once the mirrorless line came out, I've used pretty much every Sony mirrorless that has probably come out since then, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last question, and then we'll get to a couple of questions from the audience. What is the happiest moment in your career as a photographer?
The happiest moment? The happiest moment happened 2 weeks ago. So I think I mentioned that my dad worked for the newspaper as like a pressman, and so it was like this super blue-collar job, and then eventually towards the end of his career he moved up to the New York Times, which was like this huge deal for my family, that he went from like being a pressman for the Daily News to the New York Times, because it was the New York Times, you know, it kind of had this like weight. But I think for me growing up, because there was such a financial divide between us and like everyone else, like I looked at the New York Times as this paper that, like, I don't know, it was like this the paper that everybody else would be in and not somebody like me for anything. And so yeah, I got news 2 weeks ago that my book got put into the New York Times in the weekend section, which is like, as a newspaper kid growing up, I was just like, and it's in the weekend section, oh my God. Because that was like a really big deal getting that too. I can't even describe how emotional that was for me. I mean, it was maybe one of the most unbelievable moments in my life when I found it out. And then when I saw it, it was just kind of, I think it's still kind of surreal to me that it happened and it's there and yeah, I don't know.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We'll take 2 questions from the YouTube audience, and now I'm trying to figure out how to get that feed. I can't at the moment, unfortunately my Wi-Fi isn't working, but we can take 2 questions from the audience though. Anybody have questions at all? No one? Go for it.
Lydia, you mentioned that someone asked if you used a tripod, but I don't think you actually said if you did.
Okay, so he asked if, I never answered if I said if I use a tripod. No, absolutely not. Like, I would not be able to shoot in the snow with a tripod at all. Everything that even like the instances where I wait for people, because that's another component to my photography where I literally will wait hours sometimes for the right person to walk into the shot. There would be no spontaneity if I was using the tripod. Also, it would just be like completely mental to consistently break down a tripod in a snowstorm with like 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts. I'm sure that there's people out there that do it and do an amazing job with it, but just for me, it wasn't at all in my, I don't even know, in my world.
Cool.
All that night stuff is handheld.
What?
All the night stuff is handheld.
All the night stuff is handheld, yeah. It's interesting because I had this conversation with, I'm forgetting her name, with Lori. I was telling her that, you know, I'm not the most steady person in the world either when I'm holding my camera, especially when you're excited and it's like windy and there's a lot of things happening environmentally. But it was like a huge boon for me when there was more image stabilization with the Sony cameras, because I could actually go all the way down to like shutter speed 1/5 or 1/10. And some of the photos in here, like I've been asked about them, like, was that a mistake that you put like 1/10 as the shutter speed? I'm like, no, it's really actually this one is 1/10. This is one of the ones, because I wanted to get, you know, the snow streaming versus just staticky snow. So yeah, I love being able to stop all the way down and not kind of fear that one gust of wind or like one shake of my hand is going to kill it. But yeah, like I've never needed a tripod though, ever.
Cool. Any other questions?
Two-part. You're not still using GIMP, are you?
Okay, so he asked if I'm still using GIMP. I should say yes, just to shock. No, I am not using GIMP. At one point, I started making money with my career, and I got Lightroom, and I never looked back. I've used Lightroom primarily. I only use Photoshop very sporadically, I would say. Lightroom is probably like 98 to 99% of what I use in general.
So in terms of your post-processing, how much are you playing with images?
A lot. So I love post-processing. Like for me, the post-processing is so much of the artistic process for me, because it's all about the tones and bringing out different elements and turning it into what I see in my head versus what is actually happening in reality with the colors and the tones of the city and all of that. So yeah, like post-processing is a very big deal for me, and it's always been that way, and I love it.
So you go
Like,
for the mood versus what you're actually seeing?
yeah, like so very early on when I first started shooting New York, I was really fascinated by nostalgia, and specifically like nostalgia that I couldn't define. So not like the nostalgia that I was most familiar with growing up. So like, oh, I feel nostalgic if I hear a song because it reminds me of a memory, but more about like these weirder concepts of nostalgia. So like, can you feel nostalgic for a place you've never been to, or a place that doesn't exist? Like, if I read, for example, whenever I would read Chronicles of Narnia growing up, I would feel this intense sense of nostalgia when I read the book. And it's totally about a fictional place, but in my mind, even when I talk about it, I still get chills. And it turns out that those concepts exist. It's just we don't have defined words for them in English. And that's something that I was really into when I first started photography. And like, I was super into playing around with tones and trying to see, I was really interested in the response they elicited in me, but then also the response that they elicited in other people, since a lot of my early career was so out there on social media. So it was really interesting for me to get that interplay back with people and kind of hear really interesting things back from people about like, maybe they feel a sense of longing about a certain place that like only really has resonance for me because of something that happened there. You know what I mean? So yeah, for me, it's always been about mood and trying to bring out different aspects of the scene and different themes that I'm trying to explore.
We have like 2 minutes for one more question if anyone has anything. No. Go for it.
So, for younger photographers, not myself obviously, do you feel that the social aspect is a requirement nowadays?
Oh, okay, so he asked, do I feel that the social aspect is a requirement?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate myself for saying this right now because I'm definitely, I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with social media currently, because I think that, and I don't think it's fair for me to even say that. I think I have a love-hate relationship with how people use social media in terms of content creation. I wish that more people were more vulnerable and put themselves out there in a real way on social media versus a lot of what I think is happening currently. And maybe that will change with time, hopefully. But yeah, I think it's really crucial. I mean, I wouldn't have a career without social media at all. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And I think that my success as a photographer would have never happened if this was 25 or 30 years ago, when it was a very different way for people, you know, there was a different road for people to take to get noticed and kind of like get out there and build a career. I think the way that you can get successful today, there's so many different roads, and a lot of them have to do with social media. So I think it's like inevitable if you're trying to do anything with any kind of art really online. Like, I follow so many different artists online, and it's really interesting to see the evolution of all of that recently in the illustration world, in the design world, science world, everywhere. It's like really fascinating to see how people use social media or how they don't use it properly. So yeah, I mean, I think in short, yes. In long, everything I just said.
Yeah. That's all we have the time for. Viviane Goussois' book is called New York in the Snow. My name is Chris Gampat. I run the Phoblographer. Be sure to tune in to Adorama TV again next month, where we will do this again with a brand new guest. And yeah, thanks a lot, Viviane. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who came out, and thank you to Adorama. Take care.